planting a Sovereign Grace Church, the Sovereign Grace way, it's the character of the pastor and their convictions. So you know these 7 shared values, but what will happen when you're in a church plant scenario, you're the lead pastor, is that every single one of these convictions, some more than others, will be put to the test constantly. New people will come, or people will change their views over time. And so what will actually determine whether or not your church stays a Sovereign Grace church over time is your ability to know these convictions from the Bible, believe them in yourself, and not be swayed by cultural pressure or the pressure of your congregation. What I found in my time since planting is that there's a few of these that I constantly have to argue for, debate with, and lose people over. We run a course called Starting Point, which is 5 weeks. It's like your membership course, very similar. And there's always the same questions that come up, and there's always the same people that leave as a result. Now, when you're trying to grow a church, the temptation is to soften or minimize or, massage out some of the things that are offensive or that will turn people away so that you can grow your church. Because we've had great people come to our church, great men, great women, and they're all in, they're all on board, and then they hear, in our context, particularly complementarian, they hear and they're like, I cannot go to this church, we're out. We're gone, and you lose people all the time to it. It's so disheartening, and there's that temptation to be like, oh, if I just soften it, or if I just make a few little changes here or there, maybe I could keep them and win them to the church. And so, what we're going to do now is briefly just look at them, and I want to know from you guys which ones are the sticking points for you if you were planting a church here in Addis Ababa. Which ones might be the hardest ones for you to stand for publicly and you get the most pushback on? So obviously Reformed theology, that we have a big God-centered view of all things, sovereign grace, doctrines of grace, Calvinism. And we want our churches to not just assent to that, but love it, have a God-saturated view of things. Gospel-centered doctrine and preaching, you guys are all over that. That is through and through. And I don't think there's probably going to be too much pushback on that because it's so good, but you might. Continuationist pneumatology, obviously the belief that the gift goes on. And we experienced it. And, we want to not just be open but cautious, but pursuing the gifts for today because we believe God gives them to build up the church. And if we ignore them, we'll be weaker as a church. And then number 4, complementarian leadership in the home and the church, the belief that God made us male and female, made us different. We have different roles in the marriage relationship and in the church. Men only pastors, men as the leaders of their home, wives as amazing God-given gifts to be helpers and to help serve the church, but not to take those primary roles of authority. Then we have the conviction that churches are meant to be elder-led, elder-governed, not congregational. So we're not taking votes on who's a pastor. That doesn't mean that we don't obviously want to win the congregation or have their voice or their input, but we're not taking votes. We're not ruling by that. It's the elders and trying to build a plurality. And that can be a sticking point for some. And then church planting, outreach, and global missions, the idea that we want to not just be a happy little healthy church for ourselves, but we're always looking, to bring new people in, missions, and to be sending people out like Dave's church did. Sent us out with money, sent us out with people, and sent us out with their time and resources, and sending people out globally. And you guys have got multi-nations here in this class already, so this church is already thinking about that, which is amazing. And then the final one, united in mission, fellowship, and governance, meaning that we want to be a Sovereign Grace church. We want to be family together. We're not just taking money from this organization or giving money to this organization we don't care about. These are our, our fathers in the faith. These are our brothers and sisters in Christ. And so we're going to give time. We're going to give money. We're going to give our heart. We're going to give our soul to run the race together. That's sort of the 7 shared values. So you know them, I'm sure. That one involves, the book of church order. It actually involves submitting yourself to an ecclesiastical structure above you, etc. And so sometimes people can be worried about that. So in our culture, the hardest ones are probably complementarian, at times maybe continuationist. And sometimes people are a bit wary about United, like the movement, Sovereign Grace, or elder-led. So, but probably these two would be the biggest ones for us.
So these things were a challenge when I became a part of Sovereign Grace. Because I grew up Pentecostal and I grew up as a pastor's kid, so my mum preached as much as my dad. And then I was getting told, women can't preach, and you're like, you said my mum's sinning. You know, it was very personal. And Reformed theology, the whole idea of God chose you, was like, I don't think he did. No, I still remember the day. It rocked my world, and it took quite a time. And so there is, you guys need to be really convicted on these things if you're going to plant a Sovereign Grace Church. But that doesn't mean everybody that comes through the door, you're ticking them off. You're comfortable that they're not necessarily there, but you've got to know they're not there. And be like, okay, how am I going to disciple these people and help them? And which is what my pastor did with me. He didn't stop me at the door and go, you're not complementarian, so you're not coming in. But he was aware, this kid's going to need some help on this issue.
Yeah, and one of the things we often do is give people the chance to grow and say, if you're willing to keep talking to us about this, if you're willing to engage with us and not make an issue over one of these, then let's keep having a conversation about it. But if it's going to cause you to stumble or frustrate you, then go find another good church, because we don't want to constantly be like a thorn in your side because we're continually preaching the gospel of election or the free grace in Christ, etc. So, all right. I think we should do the go questions. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to put you on the spot, and maybe we'll do it in pairs because it might be a bit easier. It'll be a bit slow hearing from everyone. But what we did with our academy guys back in Sydney, because we have a one-day version of what you guys are doing, is we did these assessments with them, and we set it up like this. It was all these interview questions, but then we put them on the spot, and we just said, all right, you're in membership class, someone puts up their hand and they say this sentence, you got 90 seconds to respond. What do you say? So we're going to read out. Now, these are culturally appropriate to our setting. So if it might not be a hard question in your culture, whatever, in your church context, but you can figure that out. So we're going to just run through a few of them, and you're going to answer it to each other and just see, so you get the setting. We're in membership class. You got 90 seconds to answer, and
Someone put their hand up at the end of the class, and they're looking at you.
And you're the pastor. What are you going to say? So what's the first one?
So 5 of you have got to choose. Here's the question. So I would like to join your church, I think. I get the gospel is important, but surely there's so many other things that we ought to give our attention to. The broken are hurting, the poor are starving, and here you are singing songs and having a nice time. Shouldn't we be out helping them? Go. It's a real question. At the end of the class, they're asking you.
You can't ask a question back.
I can repeat the question. I get that the gospel is important. You guys are talking about it all the time. But surely there's other things that we ought to give our attention to. The broken are hurting, poor people are starving, and yet in this church you're just singing songs and having a nice time singing about Jesus.
All right, well, I'm enjoying, Michael, thank you for this wonderful membership class, but I just cannot believe in a God that wouldn't give us true freedom to choose and then condemn us for not choosing him. How is that fair? How could you possibly believe that? Oh. All right, Dave, you've been enjoying the membership course, have you?
Yes.
But you had your hand up. You had a question that you wanted to ask.
I come from a very Pentecostal church. I come from Pente Church, and what I've noticed about Trinity Fellowship is, you don't really seem to have the Holy Spirit like my last church. And my last church was passionate. We sang in tongues. We prophesied every week. It seems like you're quenching the Spirit here, and I'm wondering why.
Oh, yes. So, I get that women aren't meant to be elders, but can't they preach on a Sunday every now and again under the authority of the elders? Go. Yeah. I get that women aren't meant to be elders, but can't women preach every now and again on a Sunday under the authority of the elders? Why don't you do that here?
So, I get what you're saying about the women not preaching and teaching because they can't be elders. But who are my daughters going to look up to if all they see on a Sunday morning is men?
How about this one? I'm a bit nervous about the elders having all the power. Why can't the congregation keep them in check? Shouldn't they have to answer to us? Okay, well done. You guys are ready, to go plant a church. One of the things is that, as I said, and you guys could probably come up with a whole bunch of other statements that would be relevant, like things that people would push back on in a membership course or as you're trying to promote your church, etc. And I'd be interested to hear them. We won't do it right now. But you got to be ready to stand for your convictions and not change on them just because people are going to walk away, just because people are going to give you pushback, because people don't like it. It's hard. But on the flip side, you don't want to be a bully. You don't want to be aggressive. You want to loving and firm. You want to disciple people and try and win them. And you want to do what's best for them. If you believe these convictions and things are biblical, then you want to be, how can I draw them along? How can I pull them into this so that they would love it too? Because we want to have churches, Sovereign Grace churches. We're not trying to just plant, in a church where the pastor believes these things, but we want the whole church to begin to adopt these elements and own them for themselves. Otherwise, if we came to your church and, okay, Michael believes in sovereign grace, doctrines of election, but the church is all Arminian, then, it's not really going to be a sovereign grace church. So as a pastor, you've got to inculcate these values into the life of your church in various ways so that the whole church holds them as well. So it's not just about you and your values, it's about teaching your church to have them, then teaching your church to teach other people in the church and how to stand for them. Because what happens is you're in a small group setting, and then someone says, well, I think women should be able to preach. It's so wrong that every week, where's Canaan? Why isn't she preaching? And if your members aren't united in it, then they're like, yeah, I've always thought that. That is so wrong. That's terrible. It's so unjust. Or they have that, and then you get this gang mentality. Then you've got like a cancer within one of your small groups, and then they spread it to another, and then so it protects your church when you're aligned on values, and so it's really vital. Yeah, and it might be different for what you guys might do here in Addis Ababa. I mean, Michael might do something different with you. If you're sent out to plant but you don't hold the values, you guys might, because of the relationship and the time spent, have a closer partnership than, say, in another context where someone differs and they're like, all right, well, we'll see you off, brother, and good luck. And why don't you find, because I would probably encourage, if you do have that, I would say, go and find a group that is like-minded, that if you can partner with, that you can run the race together with, so that you are at least, but if you don't have that, then I'm sure there would be some level of partnership. It does just get harder because it's sort of like, well, if you left the team, I don't know if you like NBA or whatever, but if you leave the Chicago Bulls, it's like we respect you, but we're playing for the Bulls, and so we're training the Bulls players and we're coaching the Bulls players. We're not working on the Lakers. That would be kind of how it happens. One last little story just jogged my memory. My pastoral intern, Richard, he was taken out by his friends for his 40th just recently, and one of his friends is someone we know. He's another pastor in a different denomination, Churches of Christ, and he was grilling him amongst all these people on these values. It's his birthday that they're celebrating, but he's in the hot seat like you guys were just then, and they're saying to him, so you're saying that every church that has women preaching is wrong? Is that what you're trying to say? They're just wrong. They're sinful. And, they're phrasing in such a way to kind of trap him, but he's like, yes. And now, are you saying that every church that doesn't believe it are wrong? Yes. Are you saying, and you get in those situations where your values are put to pressure, and he found it hard. He even found it disconcerting. He came to me the next day and he was like, "Oh, that was like I answered this, but I didn't like it, and it's made me question some things. And can you help me talk about it?" And so you will be put under the pump. And it's one thing to say you believe it when everyone's in the class, and it's good on you, Yepsico, for stating and saying I have a different view, and I'm sure it makes it difficult. But it's one thing to say it when everyone's like, yeah, we love this. But when you're out there and people are like, no, are you saying everyone's wrong? There's something wrong with you. That's a lot harder. All right, should we do the Kanga? Yeah, Kanga, the church planter.
Well, I'm not expecting you to have all the answers, because that's obviously why we're doing church planting. But at least get us thinking about, what are all the things that are necessary, and taking one church, Kanga, to 10 koalas. How do you do that? And so, start with you guys at the back. Yep. What was some of the things you thought, yeah, if we got to 10 churches, it would take this. How many pastors do you think you would need, realistically, if you were actually going to have 10 Trinity fellowships here? Because the obvious answer appears to be 10, but that means there's no plurality in any of them. So how many pastors do you think you need to train? In terms of how many people would be in your congregation? I don't know. Depends what the Lord does, isn't it? I mean, if you got to 10 churches here, you might find this church is actually 700 or 800. But then you don't need one pastor for that. You probably need 7. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're looking at a minimum of 20 would be needed. You good? All right. So we got the training. We got the training piece, definitely. We've got to train pastors, and you start to realise 10 churches is a fair amount of pastors. You've also got the reality that for every, 10 people you have in a setting like this, all of you might become pastors, or 5 of you do. So then you're like, okay, if we need at least 20 pastors, we've got to probably train at least 40. But 20 is probably a minimum. You probably look at more like 30, in which case we've got to train at least probably 70. That's a lot of people that you've got to find and recruit and see here. So you transition there, which is good. You've gone from, okay, we've got to train leaders, but we've also got to have some strategy to this as to where would we even go, and if we go there, who are we reaching, and what is their language, and what's their usual religion, and, which is exactly right, and which takes even more training. Good. So that's a real factor, right? If you're going to plant 10 churches, it's actually like, man, we've got to put a lot of effort into equipping the saints, but also raising a maturity just in this church. Because if you say you want to plant with 20 adults plus children, well, that's 200 people plus children that are going to be gone from here. That's actually a lot of people that you're going to want to be at a reasonably good level of understanding, and well, they're going to give their time, they're going to give their finances, they're going to give their energy, they understand the values, they're going to model them. It's a lot of work. It's good work, but you are right. It's like, yeah, that's a really key component. Anything else that you came out with in any of your groups? How are you going to get to 10? All right, so we've got leadership training. We've got the whole point of equipping the saints. Wonderful. Yeah, so what you're describing is going to take time. Sometimes our history in Sovereign Grace has been so slow that it's like, yeah, it's going to take so long, so there's no risk in it by the end. And it is finding that balance of, yeah, you're not often ready after a year to go plant a church. But you probably don't need 10 years either. So it's how do we do this? How do you... Really good. Anything else? What else are you going to need? From a Sovereign Grace perspective, you definitely have to do it, yeah. Because, I mean, all our churches look different. Your church, it can feel the same, but your church still is a bit different to mine, and a bit different to then the Manila one, a bit different to the UK one, because we are different nations. Yeah. We are different nationalities, so you'd expect it to look a bit different. But the feel is always the same. The shared values are the same all around the world. They're all the same. And actually what it feels like, the shape and virtues, actually, they're all the same too. But in terms of how somebody's liturgy might look, so some of our churches would have small groups like once a week. Some would be like, they're optional, twice a month. You know, some of the details, some of the singing, some churches would be a bit more charismatic. Some churches would be like, oh, we tend to just do hymns. But they would all be expressive, but the content would be very different. You've got way room on that. I would think even I don't know your culture as well as you do, but I would think even for you, even this continent, this church is very different to our church in Liberia, which is very different to the one in Zambia. But they all feel similar. You know, you're aware we believe in the same stuff, and the values are the same, but it don't look the same. And it shouldn't, otherwise it's a bit odd. It's like, no, we're different. So yeah, you've got a lot of room on that. Contextualization is really important. Yeah, so you've got the whole issue of team development. How are you going to, it's not, well, you can do whatever you want to do, but it's a lot easier if you can go out. Well, so when Riley went out, he took a big chunk of our people, took some of our best givers, some of our best musicians, some of our leaders. It's going to make your life a lot easier that way. It's going to make it harder for the seniors.
First church plant here. That's get the cream of the crop and then
Yeah. Hint, you want to be first. You want to be first because, you get to the 10th, you're like, we haven't got many people left. So team building is really important. And even in that dynamic, you've got, you might have this person would actually be really gifted genuinely he could go, him and his family, and they'll reach out and they'll grow a church. It's just the grace of God. Whereas in this situation, they're probably going to need a team of 40 because of the area that they're going to go to and the demographic, and we need to think. So it's not all the same. So in church planting, there is that strategy piece as well. It's like it doesn't all have to be exactly the same. Our values are the same. It can be different. Yeah, you're going to be building. If you stay close to this church, you'll probably be building with some people from this church that will go. But some of you will be called further than that, where groups might say, I don't want to. We have this in Australia. Riley planted about 30 minutes from our church, so that's fine. But if you wanted to go to Melbourne, that's 10 hours in the car. If you want to go to Brisbane, it's 10 hours. And if you want to go to Brisbane, it's probably about 3 days in the car. It's so big. So you can't, it depends what you want to do. If you're going to go much further, it's less likely that a group's going to say, I want to go with you. Because then there's work realities. You're also going to find, I think, here in Ethiopia, like yourself from Kenya. So now that's a cross-cultural plan. Not for you, because you're Kenyan. But it's like, how would we relate in an East African context to like churches in Kenya? And how does that work? They're all going to have to be thought through. Because I think all Michael talked about was 10 churches in Addis. But what if you're not all going to plant in Addis? What if that isn't what the Lord has for you? So how does that work? Or what if, no, that is true, 10 churches in Addis, but there's others on top of that. They're going to be going further. How are we going to prepare for that? You've all got the really good ingredients. Now, when you're asking the right questions.